The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content. You can earn continuing education credits through ACI's online CEU program. Visit www.concrete.org to register. ACI conventions provide an opportunity for networking and for keeping up to date with the latest in concrete technology and practices.
I'd like to introduce the first speaker, which is Terry Peret from Janney Elstner. Terry, please come up.
Thank you, Jack. It's really a tremendous honor to be here today to give this talk. A Prescient Axiom, Formative Influence of the Substitute Structure Method, on behalf of myself and Sig Freeman, who is my co-author. We have a lot to talk about today. The goal of this talk, as it was originally conceived about 6 months ago, was really to discuss and to celebrate the transformational role of the substitute structure method and its developer with respect to the art, the science, the magic, and the practice of earthquake engineering. Such a talk necessarily requires that I spend some time talking about the substitute structure method itself and the detail of it, but also requires that I talk quite a bit about the context from which the substitute structure method sprung, essentially the history, the development of earthquake engineering, the antecedents to the method, and also some of the methods that have come about in the last few years that are built really on the back of the substitute structure method. As you might imagine, when I sat down a couple of weeks ago to actually begin to put together this presentation, the enormity of the scope kind of set me back, caused me to hesitate, and I discovered that I really needed to, needed to seek out inspiration really to get me going. As I often do, I turn to my Oxford English Dictionary. And for those of you who haven't used the Oxford English Dictionary, it's really tremendous. It's probably the most accessible resource for etymological research, for learning the origins of words. And in a sense, to the degree that this talk is really an epistemological talk on the study of earthquake engineering and the substitute structure method, reaching out to my OED was really not entirely out of line. The first thing I looked up, and not because I didn't know what it meant, but for whatever reason, was the word prescient, which is defined therein as having foreknowledge or foresight, foreseeing. I discovered that the first use of the word was really tied to the early days of the Renaissance in the 15th century, and that one of the notable uses of the word in the early days of its use was by Francis Bacon. Now, it's not so important what Francis Bacon said. Perhaps it's, as you'll see in a moment, it's more important that it was Francis Bacon who said it. The next word that I looked up was axiom. And again, as you all know, largely because we are in the sciences, an axiom is a proposition that commends itself to general acceptance, a well-established or universally conceded principle, a maxim, rule, or law. Its first occurrence in recorded history is also in the 15th century, and I was surprised to find yet again a reference to Francis Bacon as one of the early users of the word. Now, my high school education, I'm sure, brought up Francis Bacon, but I really didn't remember all that much about him. So my next step was to look him up. And here's what I found, that Francis Bacon was a philosopher, statesman, parliamentarian, scientist, jurist, and author. He's actually credited with being the first modern empiricist. He's credited with being the developer of the scientific method. He was a proponent of the inductive method of reasoning, demonstrating what is so by negation of what is not. He's known for deriving general axioms from what he called particulars, which were particular observations made during the course of scientific experiments or observations of nature. Of interest to me is that he idealized physics into two branches, mechanics and magic. Some things never change. I guess at the end of this little inspirational exercise, what I decided is that Mete A Sozen is kind of a modern-day Baconist, perhaps even a modern-day Bacon, and who has really brought kind of Baconian or Baconist logic and reasoning and merged it with earthquake engineering to kind of advance what it is we all do. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to start, I guess, kind of discussing the pre-substitute structure era, the dawn of earthquake engineering in this country. With the 1927, I'll pick up the pace here because I've got to get through this stuff fairly quickly. The 1927, this all started really in the 1927 UBC, where earthquake engineering principles were in the appendix. The base shear coefficient at that time was 7.5% of dead plus live when the building is on firm soil and 10% otherwise. The 1927 UBC contains this interesting quote. I have no idea really what it means, but it's interesting nonetheless. The design of buildings for earthquake shocks is a moot question, but the following provisions will provide adequate additional strength when applied in the design of buildings or structures. An interesting choice of words, a moot question, but I guess it tells us that back in 1927, engineers weren't quite so sure about what they were doing. Advanced to 1935, Uniform Building Code, the base shear coefficient reduced markedly from 7.5% of dead plus live to only 2% of dead plus half live. This particular reduction carried on through the 1946 edition of the Uniform Building Code. I personally don't know the reason for the reduction. Perhaps it was related to the economy of the times when, in the Great Depression, when the cost of building materials was very high, and we all sought means to cut back. In the 1949 Uniform Building Code, we suddenly have a change from the clearly statical mindset of the earlier building codes into something that seems to begin to accommodate the potential for dynamics as at least a player in the earthquake engineering problem. In 1949, we introduced a seismic coefficient that varied as a function of the number of stories. And as a building that was being designed got taller, the seismic coefficient went down. This change kept in place through the 1958 edition of the Uniform Building Code. Now, during this time, particularly I'll start out, kind of step back a bit, in 1952, the San Francisco section of ASCE and SEONC developed the first model lateral force provision that was specifically designed to be based on what they thought at the time was the best way to accommodate, to bring dynamics into the earthquake engineering design philosophy, and they did that by expressly introducing the concept of the period into the formula. In 1959, the SEOC Seismology Committee published the first Blue Book. In 1960, the Seismology Committee published its first commentary, and the recommendations of these committees were ultimately adopted into the 1961 Uniform Building Code, which you can see contained a fairly radical departure from the earlier codes. It introduced a formula in which accounted in some way for higher modes, and it introduced a coefficient K, which to some degree attempted to accommodate the notion that all buildings are not the same, and all building types are not the same. All structural systems are not the same. Of particular interest to this session, the 1961 UBC incorporated a brand new concept. it essentially said that structural framing systems in buildings that were more than 13 stories or 160 feet tall were required to be ductile. That code specifically credited steel frames with moment-resisting connections as automatically being ductile. Other systems, however, such as reinforced concrete, were, and I've quoted the words, were required to be proven by tests and studies to provide equivalent energy absorption. This was the first indication that we practitioners in reinforced concrete had a somewhat higher hurdle, and thus there became an instant need for the 1961 book, which is the subject of this session. This, one might argue, is the reason for its existence. The book is a classic, and it contains much of what remains relevant today. Turning to that book, as Jack indicated, but in the words of the book itself, the book focuses on developing an understanding of the manner in which a structure absorbs the energy transmitted to it by an earthquake and the maximum amount of motion or energy that the structure can sustain. This, at the time, this is an old concept to all of us now, but at the time this was a brand new concept. Brand new to the profession, essentially, and these folks really sought to characterize this concept and to transmit methodologies for accommodating it into the profession. The book focuses on many, many things that underlie practice today. I'm not going to talk about all of it because really my subject is not the book, but is substitute structure, which came after the book. But to set the stage for the context from which substitute structure arose, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about inelastic design spectra, nonlinear pushovers, and the reserve energy technique. I actually learned a tremendous amount that I'm going to share with you here in going through these books. It's interesting to me that, first of all, the book contains only a single page of what I would call conceptual discussion of inelastic design spectra. This book, well, I guess I'd always I'd read it before. I've looked at it 100 times, but it never really quite occurred to me that the concept of inelastic design spectra brought out in the book was really in its infancy here, even for Blume, Newmark, and Corning. It was just being developed. And the theme I'm going to develop for you in the next few minutes is that there actually is in the literature, there's a clear development of the concept, an evolution of the concept of inelastic design spectra over the course of 10 years. In any case, so the book puts forth really as postulates the notion of equal displacement and equal energy. What's interesting to me in reading it is that the book never ascribes, as we would today, kind of applicable period ranges or ranges of the spectra to either of these concepts. It doesn't talk about constant, and it doesn't specifically attribute equal displacement to just long period structures, for example. What's also interesting to me is the book contains this second quotation that indicates that Blume, Newmark, and Corning were at this time kind of weighing the notion of how one creates an inelastic spectrum, whether or not one should be dividing the spectrum by mu or dividing it by the square root of 2 mu minus 1. Ultimately, I'll show you in 1 second, that the single inelastic design response spectrum that the book contains reduces the acceleration velocity and displacement by mu across the full range of periods. This is the diagram from the book. It's a little I expect it'll be a little hard to read, so I've highlighted it for you. And here it is. The upper curve that is solid, or let me start, the upper curve that is solid, as denoted on the diagram, is the elastic response spectrum. The lower curve is the elastoplastic response spectrum. You can see the annotation that it's for mu of 4 to 6. There is nowhere in the book that it specifically says this is the spectrum that should be referred to when trying to derive inelastic accelerations, say, or when we're trying to derive inelastic displacements. It appears to be the curve from which the designer is supposed to derive both, which is fascinating because this is precisely the concept that changed a number of years later. At the same time, the book contains in the appendix a detailed description of another brand new method called the reserve energy technique, which was really Blume's method. And the method relies in part on force displacement pushover type analyses. We all know what they were. If you read Blume's words, you can see that he's really thinking in a manner that we think today. This concept of looking at strain and energy and work capacity, as well, he began to introduce the notion of period shifting, is really what we look for today as we evaluate and analyze structures. This is Blume's diagram, which I'm not going to talk about in detail about reserve energy, but I do think it's interesting to point out two things. First, Blume is already thinking not just of the stiffness of the frame, but the stiffness of the frame and all the stuff that goes along for the ride and might participate in the process and might be non-ductile. And again, for 1961, this is pretty advanced, I think, because there are lots of engineers who still don't think about that today all that well. I also find interesting this little diagram, which I think is testament, if you read the words of the book that accompany this, Blume acknowledges that at this time, it was very difficult to deal with entire building systems. The computational effort required to do that really made him focus on single-story type studies. And that's what that diagram represents. This is a diagram that's not from the book, but it is John Blume's reserve energy technique. It's actually taken from a paper of Sig Freeman's from a while ago, in which he dissected the reserve energy technique based upon his long use of it. And I'm going to point out a couple things that the technique is really, at least as drawn here, it's only applicable in the constant acceleration range, in the short period range. This really is fundamentally the technique. You'll note that in accordance with this plot, that this promotes equal energy, not equal displacement. The displacements are clearly, the elastic and inelastic displacements are clearly different. They differ by a factor mu. And in fact, the elastic and inelastic accelerations differ by a factor of the square root of 2 mu minus 1. This is much more in keeping, I think, with later developments, but it was introduced here. Moving forward, marching on, time marches on. In 1970, in a paper called Current Trends in the Seismic Analysis and Design of High-Rise Buildings, or structures, Newmark introduces yet another variant on the inelastic design spectrum. At least this is the first variant that I've found, in which he proposes, and I'm going to try and make this a little clearer for you again, maybe it muddies it up. He proposes essentially that you can't have just one curve to identify the inelastic accelerations and displacements, that you have to have two separate curves. Again, a revolutionary concept. The green line here that I've demarked is the ground line for the ground motion. The black line essentially is the elastic spectrum from the black motion that transitions to a dashed line where it overlays the inelastic spectra. And so this inelastic spectrum is the one you're supposed to go to for acceleration. This one is the one you go to for displacement. What I will call out here is that this conflicts with the reserve energy technique, and with the work that he himself presented in 1961. And I'll point out one other thing here, I think on the next slide, or two other things. If you look in the constant velocity range, what's fascinating is that in this particular depiction, the elastic spectral acceleration differs from the inelastic spectral acceleration by the square root of 2 minus 1. But also in the constant velocity range, the spectral displacements differ here by the factor of mu over the square root of 2 minus 1. The reason I'm going through all of this, I guess, in a nutshell, is to tell you that I guess when I learned of the inelastic design spectrum technique, I guess I always felt that these guys had tapped into a fundamental law of nature, kind of like pi or E, that the square root of 2 mu minus 1 was a bit of magic that they'd uncovered. But the reality is that these guys during this time frame were fishing around for the right answer. And you can almost imagine Blume and Newmark arm wrestling over what the right factor ought to be in what part of the spectrum. It's fascinating to watch the development because even this presentation of the inelastic design spectrum was to change yet again in 1973. This is the form that we know of it today, where in the constant velocity range, the spectral displacement, the elastic spectral displacement equals the inelastic displacement. Again, to go back to contrast, see here, the constant velocity range, the spectral displacements are different. Clearly different, the elastic and the inelastic. Here, they're not. And Newmark has incorporated kind of a transition period range in which he goes from one curve to the other. This must have been a tremendously exciting time in earthquake engineering because the early 70s is really, there's a period of a few years when I think tremendous stuff was happening, including this. Also in this time frame, in 1973, perhaps coincidentally, is when my co-author, while working for John Blume, first developed the capacity spectrum method. Also 1973, which was developed specifically to very quickly assess over 100 buildings. He was requested, Zig Freeman was requested by John Blume to use the reserve energy technique to do these assessments, but he found in applying it that it really didn't work outside the constant acceleration range. So he developed the capacity spectrum method to extend its applicability. This is it in a nutshell, at least in its early versions. You've all seen much later versions of it as it's been developed, but essentially, the early overlayment of the capacity curve on the spectrum, the incorporation of the concept that damping is changing as the building is moving over, and the fundamental concept that the period of the building is changing, and that these items can help you assess the degree of damage that the building experienced under any specific excitation. The last introductory slide before we get to the meat here is this. It's important to understand that in this very same time frame, structural analysis was also suddenly becoming, was moving into the foreground. SAP was developed in 1970, ETABS 1972, and SAP-4 in 1973. In 1971 and 1974, essentially the substitute damping and substitute structure methods were released. I'm not going to take time to differentiate between the two. They're very heavily intertwined. It should be understood that prior to the substitute structure method, all design methods were force-based. Essentially, they all began with the calculation of design forces based on the elastic period. There was no substantive consideration of displacement. There were many, many things that the substitute structure method fundamentally changed when it came out, and I'm going to have to jump to some of them. The substitute structure method was, in fact, seminal, revolutionary, and transformative. It single-handedly discarded the idea that seismic design ought to commence with a determination of design forces. It touted the importance of first identifying the quantum of damage that is tolerable as a key metric in design. This fundamentally is performance-based engineering. This is what we do today. We start by saying, how much damage can we tolerate? This concept really this was fundamentally the first displacement-based design method. Substitute structure diminished the significance of the elastic period. It explicitly accounted for an intended level of inelastic behavior in the structure. And it was the first that I know of to explicitly identify the intended function of the structure as a key factor in the development of design criteria. As importantly, it anticipated the coming of computerized application of elastic methods as a design tool. The testament to the substitute structure method being seminal, revolutionary, and transformative is that today it actually appears to be wholly ordinary. We accept its principles without thinking twice about it. Its underlying premises have been absorbed into and pervade modern earthquake engineering theory, practice, and methodology. I'm going to skip a few slides because I'm running out of time, but for anyone who later wants to look up the presentation, I've included some words that from the documents that presented the substitute structure and substitute damping methods. Essentially, the method starts by determining the stiffness of a substitute frame based on predetermined tolerable limits of inelastic response. This really is the leap between it and substitute damping. Substitute damping did not contain an explicit kind of initiating predetermined tolerable limit, I guess, as the jumping off point for design purposes. This is the method as it's been put forth in the papers. And again, I will skip some of this, but essentially the method, as I indicated, really begins with identifying a tolerable damage ratio, identifying the secant stiffness associated with that for individual members in the building, and then performing an analysis. The legacy, of course, of substitute structure, the legacies are many. I would tell you that performance-based engineering methods, and in particular things like this, wouldn't have happened had substitute structure not articulated concepts first. I would tell you also that displacement-based design methods, which are coming to the fore really in the last 10 years, almost every conference you go to now contains, and almost every journal edition contains articles on displacement-based design methods, most of which make reference to substitute structure and or substitute damping. I'm not going to, I have a list of about 6 or 7 of these methods, but you can look them up independently. There's one of them, of course, is Jack Maley's, proposed in 1992. And so I will rush right through them to my closing, which is right. There are some of these are great methods, by the way. Okay, closing. Essentially, the lineage and much of the approach and philosophy of earthquake engineering today, even at the leading edge of what we do today, can be traced back to the work and influence of Mete A, Sozen, as exemplified by substitute damping and substitute structure. The prerequisite to performance-based assessment being the pre-selection of acceptable performance objectives was first really articulated in substitute structure. Mete A, Sozen has long stressed that deformation-based metrics, not strength, ought to define the primary seismic design criteria for securing desirable seismic response. This is a position that's now taken for granted by the rest of us. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a question while I move the slides to the second speaker. So remind us, when was this displacement-based design idea developed? I thought it was something from like this century. It was from the last century?
All the way back in the last century. Antediluvian almost.
Okay, other questions, comments? All right, well then thank you, Terry.